Everyone, thank you very much for joining us today.
Yes.
My name is Sean Godoy. I'm Gauteng chapter lead for the SA Chamber of Commerce in the UK. So we're looking at the budget beyond the numbers and what that means for South Africa. So obviously a lot of political activities and sort of, I suppose, strategies playing out, which make things very interesting. I'd just like to introduce our panel. So firstly, we have Rajan Pillay, who is an ExCo member of the South African Chamber of Commerce UK, and he's also CEO of Garuda Capital. So Rajan will be leading our discussion today. Next, we have Alan Mukoki, who has many years' experience working as a senior executive, board-level executive, and non-executive director for various major private and public entities in South Africa, including, amongst others, Kula Finance, Business Partners, People's Bank, Land and Agricultural Bank, Nedbank, and Natale. So, Alan, thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you.
Next, we have Natale Labia, who is a partner at Lionhead Capital. So he's based in Italy, but he works for Lionhead, which is a partner at Lionhead, which basically has a private equity fund focusing on sub-Saharan Africa. He has postgraduate degrees in economics from various European universities, and he also writes in his personal capacity on economic and political matters in publications such as the Daily Maverick. Without further ado, Rajan, I'm going to hand over to you to start the discussion.
My name is Rajan Pillay. I'm an ExCo member of South African Chambers in the UK. And we're very thrilled to be able to host this webinar today on the budget, beyond the numbers. The budget went for a hearing in Parliament fairly recently. It was last week, having been postponed the first time. And it's quite historic in that it's probably the first budget that's not been passed by the Minister of Finance. And there are certain peculiarities and reasons behind it. And then we need to look at, in the course of this webinar, the impact of that. Maybe Alan, the CEO of Mr. Alan Mukoki, CEO of the South African Chamber. I wonder if you could please maybe weigh in with some preliminary comments, and then we can go to Natale, and then pick up any further questions and discussions on that. Over to you, Alan.
Thanks, Prof, and thanks to the other colleagues and panelists. And indeed, thank you for inviting us to this session. We are going through some interesting and trying times as South Africans. And our take, of course, of the budget is that it was always going to be something that's difficult. It's difficult because many of us have run businesses, and we know that when your revenues are not matching your expenses, you are always going to get into trouble because there's only one or of two ways of running anything. You're either going to attack your revenues or you're going to attack your expenses. The expenses are where they are. The expenditure for government is where it is because it's driven by policy as well as political considerations. It would be very difficult at this particular point in time to look at the 3 or 4 areas where you think you can cut. A large chunk of those expenses right now, which is one of the critical areas of difficulty for the South African government, is that if you look at the debt servicing costs as a percentage of revenue, and you look in that period 2010, 2012, the numbers were still around the 10% mark. And if you look at the numbers today, they've moved up to about 22%. 22% is a very high number, considering that it means you're actually spending 22 cents of every rand that you receive by way of servicing just the debt itself. And it's caused by a whole range of other different things that we'll probably explore as we move along in the conversation. So you have that as a big issue. And then you've got the second issue, which is huge as well, that relates to infrastructure. Because that infrastructure is necessary. Most things are falling apart. Water and sanitation, you've got big issues around the energy system. You have a lot of issues around, the logistics and transportation sector around roads, right? And that kind of stuff. So in the final analysis, I think that you've got to confront those things, because these are big things. These are not things that you can figure a way of postponing. And then you've got the social stuff relating to, you did take a decision that you're going to give the stress relief a grant, the SRD grant of about 350. And so many people, of course, who depend on social grants is a very big number. And politically, it would be a very suicidal decision to see whether you can actually reduce that or you can take it away. When it was given for the first time, there wasn't much of an allocation in the budget. It was a knee-jerk reaction, obviously influenced largely by COVID. But you got into that situation where when you start something, what is Bono and U2, they have this song where they talk about when you get stuck in a place where you can't get out of. You know, it's a similar thing. You got stuck in that place and you can't actually come out of it. And then the fourth component, of course, is the civil sector wage bill, the difficult political decisions that need to be taken there in terms of, you know, you've got X number of public servants. They also need to get an inflation-adjusted increase, which the minister was trying to articulate. Very difficult at this particular point in time to tamper with the public service system in terms of retrenchments, because those people will go into the unemployment queue itself, and politically that would be very difficult, because the majority party, or the former ruling party, which is still the majority party, in a sense, when we talk about the GNU, it's still an ANC-led GNU. It's very intensive in terms of the union component, because, as you know, quite a significant cohort of the ANC leaders are themselves former union bosses, starting with the president, you know, Minister of Energy, the former Secretary General of the National Union of Mine Workers. So you have a lot of unionists there. The FM himself, the finance minister himself, is a former union boss. So you have a very strong component of the union component within the ANC as a ruling party. As you know, the majority of people who get elected in ANC branches can only be those who went to school somewhat. And generally, you'll have the teachers and the shop stewards being the people who form the core of the branch chairs and the branch secretaries, and some former activists. And by the time you get to conference, there's a much more stronger element of the union part of the leadership that dominates the activities and the discussions. So I think that those were all very, very difficult options, and we got where we got to be, but it's not a particularly sustainable program, because until you answer the question relating to how you're going to generate the revenue and how you're going to deal with the issue of the burgeoning salary bill and the interest that is being paid, we're on hiding next to nothing. So let me leave those comments here for now, Prof.
It's now my pleasure to invite Natale to maybe give a few preliminary comments, and then we can try and take the discussion further and deeper. I also have some other comments to come in with. So Natale, if you could please let us have your take on it, where we stand, what are the implications, and what can the electorate and the country expect going forward. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Raj. And thank you to Raj and Sean for the very kind invitation to speak to the Chamber of Commerce. And to everyone, yeah, it's great to be part of this very interesting discussion at this, as you say, a very important kind of juncture in the history and in the journey of the political economy of South Africa. Alan, thank you for some extremely incisive and perceptive introductory comments. I think you touched on some really critical elements of what we should delve into today. The title of this webinar, I think, is you know, it says everything really that it needs to, and that kind of there is no budget that has been tabled for South Africa in which it really is. It's not a question of discussing the budget. It's a question of discussing beyond the budget, because as we've seen in the last couple of weeks, there are so many different moving parts beyond just a speech made by the finance minister and a lengthy document tabled by the Ministry of Finance as to how the revenue will be allocated. There are a lot of political machinations going on behind the scenes. You know, I've been invited to speak as an economist, and that is my day job. But I think more and more one has to delve into the politics of what is kind of going on here. And I think, Alan, you did a really exceptional job of touching on some of those dynamics. But I think it's useful to kind of step back and to look at how we got here on almost a global level. If you take the last few years since COVID, 2024, as we're all aware, was the single biggest kind of festival of democracy, as it was termed, as more democracies went to vote all over the world than ever before. And the overwhelming takeaway from 2024 was this really tossing out the incumbents. I think it was something like 80% of all the elections that happened last year, the incumbent political parties that were in power were actually were turfed out, and people were just looking for something else. And South Africa is no exception. Obviously, there was coming out of COVID and many other sort of dark and tiresome chapters in the history of South Africa, from state capture to load shedding, etc., meant that there was this upwelling of dissatisfaction with the ANC, which culminated in the government of national unity. And that's kind of the backdrop to this extremely dramatic and unprecedented last few weeks that we've seen. The politics is back, and I think when you look at that kind of dynamic, this budget is yet another step along the path of politics in South Africa moving from democracy or power being exercised within the Thuli House to politics being exercised and power being exercised within the National Assembly. And we've seen that this is a very clear demonstration by the coalition partners of the ANC that they are not just there to rubber stamp, as used to be the case. The Minister of Finance would present what he wanted to do, and obviously the National Assembly would be forced to just go along with it, because the ANC until last year had an overwhelming majority. That is, by and large, a healthy development, and it should be seen in the light of the maturing of South African democracy and the institutional deepening as it moves beyond effectively a kind of a one-party democratic setup to actually debating and having a truly kind of democratic, open platform for debate as to where, in this instance, where budget is allocated. And I don't think, and on that point, one should really not discount the importance of passing a budget. It is basically the one job that governments have to do, and it's time and time again we've seen, especially in systems of proportional representation like South Africa, that by and large there are coalition governments, that it's the budget which is the moment when the kind of rubber hits the road in terms of, can a government survive? Can a coalition survive? And I think it's interesting to see those dynamics playing out in South Africa. I'll give you the example of Germany, another proportional representation democracy, where last year it was Olaf Scholz and the SPD whose frustrations with the Liberal Party, the FDP, and their inability to take on some of those the SPD's concerns, that brought down the government, and he fired the finance minister, leading to the snap elections, which we saw last month, and the new coalition government, which is being formed in Germany. And in another European example, not proportional representation, but in France, last year Emmanuel Macron spent months trying to cobble together a government to pass a budget, and it brought down the one of his prime ministers, Michel Barnier, until Bayrou was brought in, and finally he managed to get the budget through. So just to put this in a global light, these democratic debates and dynamics around a budget are not specific to only specific to South Africa, but it's just that these are critical moments for democracy, and how the coalition government does progress, and does manage, and how long it will survive. So I think that, I don't want to talk too long, and I think it'll be very interesting to go to questions. But the second point is really on the budget itself that was tabled. People around this topic often sort of glibly remark that South Africa's run out of money, and there's, I think, to Alan's points earlier, there are some very concerning trends, and the fiscal picture has worsened consistently, particularly since the beginning of the Zuma years, really the global financial crisis. But that's not to say everything is lost. South Africa continues to run a primary surplus, which means that effectively the books are more or less balanced outside of, to Alan's points, the ever increasing debt service costs. So the crucial thing here is that South Africa has not gone the way of other emerging markets where spending has spiraled completely out of control. It's just that the costs of borrowing have gone up, and we haven't been able to cut costs as much as we should have, through some of the political points that you remarked on, but also, and this is the fundamental point, in the absence of real material economic growth. So the issue is not that the spending has just we've become a kind of like we've seen in other emerging markets in Latin America, for example, and even in parts of Asia, where the Ministry of Finance have kind of lost all control of spending. That hasn't happened in South Africa. What's happened in South Africa is cost of borrowings have gone up, and you've had this just drag in terms of low economic growth year after year after year, which means there's been this kind of slow burn into what is starting to become a potential fiscal crisis. So credit to Treasury, credit to the SARB, but I think now real decisions need to be made. And I think this is, and what's so interesting about having this discussion now is that this coalition government have really brought it to a head. Just one other point, I think it's instructive to note that last year, the kind of headline measure that was brought in was around selling gold and foreign exchange reserves to fund a shortfall. That was seen as a kind of a one-off. So, already that was a warning sign. Now, the markets actually reacted quite positively to that, which I thought was quite surprising. But it was clearly a demonstration of the fact that the times were getting desperate, and the kind of desperate measures had to be brought in. This year, they couldn't do that again. So what did they do? They decided to hike that. And I think it's now a question of, you can't continue pulling these sort of, headline rabbits out the hat to try to balance the books year after year. Clearly, something has got to give. And the discussions now that we're seeing within the GNU, and that we're having on, on panels such as this, I think are very, are all about, okay, if something's going to give, then what is that going to be? So yeah, that's, I'll hand back to Raj and the rest of the panel.
Thank you for your input, Natale. I think the point you made is that this is not unusual for democratic governments to be faced where a budget has difficulty in passing. The slight difference in South Africa is that the feeling that we're getting is that the ruling party is not used to being in a coalition. and they don't understand as much as they should have as to how coalitions require consensus. Hence, President called the GNU together on the Monday with a clangor and expecting them to rubber stamp and endorse changes for the Wednesday. Clearly wasn't going to happen. And a little bit of a perhaps political kind of move up. But that's fine. And we're going to have to do that. But I think in the broader context, yes, this is normal of democracies and can be expected. We just haven't had it in South Africa previously. But times are changing. Having said that, I think, and coming back to the point of Mr. Mokoki earlier, there are different players behind the political parties who exercise a certain amount of influence, one of whom is the unions. We are aware of discussions currently, confidential discussions currently, to actually replace the finance minister. And we are aware of probably the incumbent coming in. What Natale was saying is that really we need to look at structural changes, because the structural changes is the result of why we have reached this position. And selling the family silver last year, or getting rid of gold and or disposing of gold and foreign exchange reserves to bridge it, is a once-off option. And it's not going to happen again. So it comes back to the structural point, which Alan mentioned in his opening comments, the unduly high interest rates. I was interviewed by CNBC last year for the 2024 budget, and that's exactly what I said, that there's undue cost of servicing debt. And if the growth predictions in the economy are met, then the forecast GDP of 1.5% growth or thereabouts was sustainable and not too much damage. But as Natale had pointed out, we've been languishing in this period of very slow growth, and that brings everything to a head as it currently is. So on that point of both Alan and Natale for a credit re-rating exercise. And we've been on this in terms of Garuda Capital for quite a while now. But in terms of the numbers that we're putting forward to the presidency, should a re-rating exercise be undertaken in a sincere and a deep manner, it could result in savings of about 288 billion in interest. We also, in terms of the macro numbers, felt that of the billions and billions of dollars that left the country post the junk status and the downgrading, was about 128 billion could come back in. And then we're coming up with various other suggestions, for example, rewriting the national accounts from a cash-based accounting system to an accrual base, which 200 billion rand worth of unexpensed items, or items which don't need to hit income straight away. So there's various aspects around that. We've been mandated to approach the Portfolio Committee on Finance to say we object to the VAT, this, that, and the other. So it's come to a point now where I think we've never reached this point before, but where budgets are openly contested and fiercely contested, and more openly challenged, rather than the period of previously where it was just merely endorsed by the majority and it went through the various hoops. So I think it's an exciting time. There's a bit of a political price to be paid. And that's going to be happening in the near future. But beyond the numbers, I think one really needs to look at the structural impediments to the budget, and that is the period of low growth. Unauthorized expenditure by the metros and municipalities, there's a couple of hundred of those, and there's unauthorized expenditure of billions of rand. So a rein needs to be brought on to the spending patterns. And then, of course, you've got to come back to the balancing books and seeing how you can boost your revenue. And on that side, South Africa has the highest Gini coefficient. And we're seeing it in the personal income tax rates, where personal taxes account for the highest slice of revenue. Sim Shabalala, the CEO of Standard Bank, went on record a few weeks back saying exactly what we've been saying, that the country's ratings, if looked at through a different lens, a slightly different prism, could maybe allow for an upgrade in maybe 2 or 3 notches than it currently has. So there's a lot of work to be done, and I think a lot of people around the country are scrambling to get that work done.
I think our great discussion so far. There were a lot of unknowns or outcomes that couldn't be sort of expected with the GNU as a whole, and obviously the budget is probably the largest of those to date. But in terms of the GNU and how it operates, obviously it's unprecedented and it's brand new for all the political parties. In terms of the kind of the machinery and the protocol, are political parties, are they coming against sort of genuine sort of areas where they're still learning how to deal with this? Because obviously there's a lot of politics, but is the GNU, how the terms of engagement, obviously they're clear, but are parties genuinely sort of coming up against unexpected sort of matters of their own in terms of processing? Because obviously the budget showed the ANC, perhaps try to do business as usual. So is this a very much like a big learning curve for our parties, and like currently as well, even having a terms of engagements, etc., drafted? So I mean that can go to the panel.
Thanks, Sean, and thank you, Raj. If I may just jump in there on a few points, which I think are super interesting. Sean, excellent question, and I think you touched on some of the key dynamics. And just to build on what Raj said, the key thing is kind of what happens now. This is an unprecedented scenario for these political parties, whether it's the ANC, whether it's DA, whether it's the Patriotic Front. These guys are Patriotic Alliance. They're all kind of having to learn, I guess, and in a situation that they haven't been before, and that can only be a good thing democratically. This budget now goes obviously to parliamentary committees, where each department has to debate, and there will be I'm sure a vibrant debate as to how they feel that that particular department was recognized and was budgeted for in the proposal from the Minister of Finance. And then obviously it will eventually go to vote. And I think that vote, from what I've most recently seen, has been tabled for kind of early mid-May. So as of early mid-May, after the next 6 weeks or so of debate in various parliamentary committees, the National Assembly has to sit and either there'll be a majority in favor of this budget or not. In which case, if it isn't, then I that would be really very unprecedented, and I think would raise serious questions as to the durability and the viability of this government. But I think just two points on that. One is that, especially if you look at what markets are saying, I could see, here the rand peaked around after the DA announced that they weren't going to support the measure. The rand spiked up to about 18.5, 18.6 to the dollar. It's come all the way back down to 18.14. So on that basis, at least, there's some sort of not complacency, but trust that this government will actually be able to get this budget through. Perhaps not exactly as it currently stands, but more or less there will be some sort of negotiation over the next few weeks, and that's the fact is that the ANC only has to bring in a couple of smaller parties to get this measure through. So I think it's got to be a good thing. The other point, which is probably worth mentioning, is the fact that even if this budget isn't passed, it's not as if all spending is going to suddenly stop. South Africa doesn't have a constitutional debt ceiling imposed like the US does and several other democracies, which is, if a government actually can't legislate to increase borrowing or have a budget on the table, then literally, it stops paying public sector workers. Whereas that can't happen in South Africa. So I think the chance of any kind of economic shock on that basis is lessened. So whatever happens, the system will continue jogging along. But to your point, Raj, on austerity and kind of the 2024 budget and then how this budget stacks up, I think one has to be sympathetic to the position in which the Minister of Finance and Treasury found itself. They realistically couldn't cut public sector salaries aggressively and cut expenditure across the board as much as probably markets would like to see, or that is ideal. And that's not just for some of the political reasons which Alan spoke about earlier and which you spoke about. It's also because cutting expenditure is bad for the economy. Whether it's money that goes to paying the salaries of SOE employees or government workers, nurses, teachers, police employees, etc. If you stop paying them, then that has a real impact on economic growth. So I think it's not that this money is being wasted. A lot of the public sector expenditure is actually is on some level or not keeping the economy going because so little else is. So I think one has to be quite careful. If there are major cuts to expenditure, it will have a really negative effect on, say, economic growth. Too many people just say, that this is a wasted expenditure that's going towards public sector employees. Bring in a Doge or cut costs, etc. That would have not just a deleterious effect on the SA economy. It would also have a deleterious effect on social dynamics in South Africa. So I think what one does have to be careful, and it's not kind of one, there's not one fix for all. To your final point on monetary policy, this is a discussion which is had a lot, and it's become more and more controversial and well, whether or not it's controversial, but it's more and more acceptable to start to challenge stuff like the independence of the SARB and the mandate of the Reserve Bank. Should the Reserve Bank be more growth friendly? And I think there are very much two schools of thought. Can a Reserve Bank be pro-growth? And I think that's it's a theoretical discussion, which economists have had for generations, but it's also a very practical one. And I think one has to be quite careful to go down that route because, and it's not just, obviously the biggest, the most important reserve bank in the world, the Fed, has a double mandate to pursue full employment as well as stable prices. But I think in the context of an emerging market, if the mandate of the Reserve Bank was changed, and if they were on some level or another forced or felt they should cut interest rates to stimulate the economy, I think that could have a potentially a positive effect on the economy in the short run. But I think the potential medium and long-term implications when that filtered through for long-term price expectation, inflation expectations, I think could actually hurt South African consumers a lot more than they could stand to gain in the short term. But I think these types of discussions are indicative of the very difficult situation in which we find ourselves. Because let's be honest, if the economy was growing at 3% a year, no one would be having a conversation about the independence or the mandate of the Reserve Bank.
Yeah, my comments on the GNU is it's quite clearly going to be a very difficult, I would think, arrangement. But I recall specifically before the general elections that the leader of the DA had tried to forecast what the political situation might be after the elections, and she said something that sort of like made me to pay a little bit of attention to her strategy at the time. And she said that for the DA, they had an ambition that they could win the election outright. That would be a first priority for them. And they realized that that probably is not going to be a possibility right now. So their second priority was, in fact, to stop and allow. This is all public. You can check this on YouTube or somewhere. Their second priority as a DA was to stop a possibility of an ANC-EFF coalition. And then the third, grudgingly, would be to try and get an ANC-DA coalition going on. Now, you'll all recall, because these are all contextual issues that are very important to understand what then would happen when it comes to the GNU's articulation or finding common positions around what policy would or would not work, and whether any semblance of an agreement can in fact be reached. The DA went into this process with an understanding that they were trying to form a grand coalition with the ANC. There is something that is not coming out in the media in South Africa in terms of the discussion around meaning, impact, effect, and affect. It is that the two parties got together in the GNU as the major parties, but they've got totally, completely different understandings of that very GNU. Number one, the DA always assumed that the parties that have 60%, which effectively would be themselves and the DA in the GNU, can move forward to take decisions about other things. Now, you've seen the haji-baji between the Secretary General of the ANC, Mbalula, and Helen Zille, who's the chairperson of the DA Federal Council, on the interpretation of that letter of intent in terms of what was actually meant. And they verified in respect of why the ANC, having agreed to give the DA the number of ministers that they agreed on, would then go ahead and extend the size of, increase the size of cabinet, and then allocate only those new positions to themselves as the ANC. Because the ANC did not see this as a coalition between themselves and the DA. The ANC always maintained that they were putting together a government of national unity with all the parties that agreed with the ANC, not parties that agreed with the GNU. In other words, there is no such a thing as a statement of intent by the GNU parties as a collective GNU. There are only agreements by the individual parties with the ANC, which is a very, very, very important point of departure in terms of interpretation of exactly what it is that you see. So from that particular point, as a majority party, and one of the other things that they did, and I'm not so sure whether the people in the DA had a different understanding at the time, is that the preamble to that agreement in the GNU starts by saying that all the parties commit to uphold and respect the Constitution of the Republic. Now, you and I know, as people who are in business, that we can get together as shareholders and maybe invite someone from outside, a young female, and say she must join us as shareholders. And then we put together an agreement that she agrees to, that she will have a minority shareholding purely on the basis of the fact that she's female. And she's happy with that, because the 10% that we're giving to her, she has never seen before. She agrees. The problem with that particular agreement is that it is invalid in terms of the Constitution of the Republic. You and I cannot agree to violate the law. The Constitution of the Republic says there shall always be equality, and you cannot discriminate against people on the basis of gender, race, religion, or sexual orientation, or whatever the case might be. Notwithstanding the fact that the person who's agreeing with you has signed to say, I'm happy with this thing that we've actually signed. The IN started one of the first problems, that even though you've agreed in the GNU that you will talk to each other, you'll allocate the cabinet, the Constitution of the Republic says it's only the president who's allocated the powers to appoint the cabinet. Now, you've signed an agreement, you want to have another agreement that must subordinate the constitution, and that is not actually going to be possible. So that came out as one of the structural features and defects of this particular agreement that they were having. But the big gorilla in the room is this thing that South Africans always want to be polite and they don't want to always discuss, is the real story in South Africa is one of transformation. Are the parties to the GNU all of one mind in terms of what that means if you say you're going to transform South Africa? Because there are two parts of transformation, by the way. Sometimes we always talk about the transformation that relates largely to fixing the historical problems, apartheid, colonial dispossession, and things like that. And in that particular context, we've now forgotten to speak about the transformation of the SA economy when it comes to what are these reforms, the structural reforms that we need to be able to talk about. That is not coming out strongly in the GNU discussion, even amongst the parties as a common feature. And what do I mean by that? South Africa faces, and the rest of the continent and basically our region, almost something like 3 deficits. You'll say there's an energy deficit, that's the first thing. Then you have a food deficit. You know, before the end of colonialism, Africa used to be the food basket of the world. And around 1957, the Europeans kept together to form the EEC. And after that, they formed the Common Agricultural Policy that then looked at food sufficiency for the rest of Europe. And they started to subsidize their own farmers. That forced a lot of the African farmers to actually go bust because they could not compete. The same thing that Trump is doing now, that the Europeans are actually interestingly complaining about. They were doing it after the Rome Treaty in 1957 because they did exactly the same thing with their own agri to protect their own agriculture and make sure that those farmers will have at least a living wage within that particular European community, and all those things that actually did happen. So now we end up in a situation where today Africa is importing 85% of what it consumes when it comes to food. You go to the energy story, it's exactly the same thing. Nigeria is probably the #1 oil producing country in Africa, yet they're importing almost 100% of the refined product that they're using. And hopefully with Dangote's refinery coming on stream, they will be able to reduce that. But I don't even think that he'll be able to touch 10-20% of what is needed in Nigeria itself. Angola, the second largest producer of oil, is importing 85% of the refined. So we ended up in this particular situation, even in South Africa. We export the soil and the rocks. So we export the low-value products, and then we import the high-value product. This manufacturing deficit creates a huge issue because that really creates very, very serious structural issues around the devaluation of your currency, because this is what you're doing. What you're doing, you're importing inflation, and this is not necessarily in our favor. So this idea around industrialization and making sure that we're going to the competencies and the skills to be able to build a strong manufacturing base, which requires strong base load in terms of energy. Not what we're doing now with renewable energy, because renewable energy is not able to power those huge furnaces and those big plants that you require to process and beneficiate your minerals. So we have to make these particular choices around what we mean by transforming in the area of structural reform for the entire economy. It is not just a question of we need to fix load shedding by giving people some solar products and giving some people some wind, because that's not necessarily going to assist us in building that particular strong industrial base. So all these issues then need to be discussed. But I'm saying the transformation piece that relates to fixing the past in respect of historical disadvantages, dispossession, is one of the areas where the major GNU partners are not actually in agreement, which creates a risk in terms of whether this thing is going to last. The DA has opposed the NHI, the National Health Insurance. The DA has opposed the bill that relates to education. The DA has opposed just about all the transformation pieces that deal with trying to fix the past. And the ANC's intent on actually going forward. And so there's a risk there that the more you push on your agenda, on your own platform, on your own political platform, because essentially the two major parties to the GNU exist to oppose each other. So the more one is pushing forward in terms of its own agenda, and for the ANC, they don't have a choice, because you've got the EFF and MKP waiting outside, putting extreme pressure on the ANC. The ANC itself did not lose the election, contrary to what people say. The ANC didn't lose the election to the opposition parties. It lost the election to its own factions. So people need to always appreciate that. The ANC didn't lose the election to the DA or IFP. They lost the election to MKP and EFF. Those are all factions of the ANC, and they are the ones who are now putting more pressure on the ANC itself in terms of driving that transformation agenda. So we're all going to be in an era of having a lot of fun and excitement over the coming periods, but it looks like that's where the fish is actually going to come from. Whether it's going to crack, we don't know. Thank you so much, Prof.
Thank you, Alan. That was most insightful and I think quite comprehensive. There was a question put forward by one of the members attending with respect to Eskom, saying that over 115 billion rand is owed to Eskom. Under the current system, Eskom has to be financed because the municipalities collect the money and that money doesn't flow back through to Eskom. The suggestion was that with this big, very large state-owned entity, can we improve the position a bit by maybe allowing Eskom to collect its own debts as would be a normal commercial debt, rather than allowing the municipalities and metros and Munichs to do the invoicing billing, and then Eskom gets stuck with a non-payment issue, which worsens its financial position materially. Is there anybody who would like to maybe take that, Natale?
Sure. Thanks, Raj. And it's certainly an interesting question. I think it needs to be seen in the broader context of the future of Eskom. If Eskom was privatized and it was split up, then this obviously wouldn't be a topic really for discussion, because that's what would happen anyway. Yes. There would be independent power producers and there would be independent power distributors, and consumers could weigh up who they wanted to buy power from. Who was most competitive, as happens in competitive markets for power kind of anywhere in the world, whether it's in the US or EU or wherever. So I think that's obviously where one does want to get to, more or less. I mean, I think there's broad consensus on that, at least within the more kind of free market, centrist parts of the ANC, and then obviously the DA. But the question is politically how you get there, which we've seen kind of does take a lot longer than is ideal. So yeah, I hope that addresses the question.
I think that from my side, it would just be a realization that for South Africa, in terms of where we are from a crossroads point of view, is an acknowledgement that we can't fix South Africa's problems unless we adopt a system of a meritocracy, and by that I mean that we have a people problem. We don't necessarily have any other problem. I think that all problems start with whether you have the right people and whether society is working together to make sure that we understand what the challenge is in front of us. I made a comment a few years ago that got me into trouble with a cabinet member, because I had said that I didn't think the president would succeed, purely because he has an inability to choose a team. And if a job is a 10, you need to know that you need to put a person that's a 10 there, or a potential 10 there. You can't put a 4 or 5 person into a 10 job. And most cabinet jobs, as you look at them now, they are probably maybe at an 8+ level, maybe 10s. Maybe you can exclude things like culture and stuff. But I'm sure Mr. McKenzie would disagree with me. And that's critical, because the world has moved since that particular period. The complexity that people are dealing with now is at a very, very difficult level. Most people who are in politics were not given an opportunity in this country due to the history of having executive skills, leadership skills, the training and the development, the mentorship, and the coaching in that particular regard. So we are forcing, when you force someone into failure, you're forcing people into a situation where they will not necessarily be able to cope with a function. It has not necessarily helped, contrary to any other psychological narrative that is there, that the DA colleagues have come into the cabinet, because they themselves are not particularly strong intellectually. They themselves lack experience. They themselves don't have, the wherewithal and the performance track record, because most of them have never also been in jobs of that particular nature. And it doesn't help when you bring people who are also less educated. And it's not because people are not there in society. So we need to figure a way of finding people who are really, really great and do what Lee Kuan Yew did in Singapore, go and compete in the private market sector for the best quality and the best skills so that we can bring them into government, into cabinet and places like that. Once you change that culture, then you can start doing things that are very significant. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mokoki. Greatly appreciated. Very quick word from you, Natale, to please wrap up.
No, thank you very much, Raj. Thank you very much, Alan. I think it's been a fascinating, really fascinating, very open discussion. I've thoroughly enjoyed it. Going forward, and just to touch on one point you raised, Alan, which I think is really critical, and that's just the lack of work that was done at the beginning of this GNU as to kind of what the government actually stood for and what these various parties were on board with and what they agreed about. If you look at other more other coalition-based democracies, it often takes a month to put a coalition together, and where there is real negotiation about, okay, what are we going to stand for the next 4 or 5 years, and that just never really happened. And I think it's always going to make the GNU, as in those cartoons of Zapira, a kind of a fairly ungainly animal. And I think it's the question is, between now and 2027 and the next ANC conference, NEC, I think when there is a change in leadership of the ANC, I think that could potentially herald the end of this government. I can't necessarily see it continuing from there. But thank you, everyone, it's been a pleasure.
Thank you to Mr. Mokoki for the South African Chamber of Commerce and Industry, and Natale for kind of giving us your time. I think it's a big topic, and I think in the time that we've allocated, we've ventured out, I think, quite a number of ideas, which hopefully can be taken forward more positively.
Excellent. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for joining us, and thank you to the panel for a fantastic conversation. And we will end it there. So good day to everyone, and thank you again.